So I just uploaded a video quite recently where I demonstrated that I converted a thumbs up mini retro racer toy arcade cabinet into a fully functional little mini arcade racer capable of playing the original Outrun and a load of other classic racing games in MAME. And I explained at the start of that video that I was planning to put together another video just to explain the process involved in how I actually converted this. And here it is! The thumbs up retro racer toy cabinet was something I picked up at a local shopping centre where I had some vouchers I needed to use up there, and it cost about £30. And it's something that plays a load of 8-bit games that look graphically like they're the equivalent of something that you'd find on the Sega Master System or the NES or NES or Nintendo Entertainment System, however you're supposed to pronounce it. Now those two 8-bit systems, and also the Sega Game Gear, which was an 8-bit console itself, did have some really excellent little racers on them, but unfortunately the 30 racers that are on this retro racer toy cabinet here are not. They are generally of fairly poor quality and generally quite simplistic and just a bit rubbish really. There's one particular one where you're racing and there's no bends in the track, and it's got a little bit of music that will just slowly drive you insane as it repeats on a little 5-second loop. If you don't believe me, let's just see a little bit of it now. Oh sweet Jesus, please make it stop! So anyway, you get the idea. Hardware that basically could actually play some decent games, but the actual games on offer in the cabinet are sadly rather shite. But I mean, what are you expecting though for a novelty toy that you can get for £30, which you can actually get for less than that now. I'm seeing them on Amazon for about like £20. And anyway, the whole reason I bought this little mother chuffer is because I'm a bit of a sucker for micro arcade cabinets. I've got a small collection of them, and I've also got a little Outrun collection on the go as well, and I thought it would be really nice just to have a little retro racer mini arcade machine to fit in with all these. And after it had been on display next to all the Outrun stuff here for a little bit, I started to get a little plan in my mind about, well, wouldn't it be nice if I could actually dress up the cabinet to make it look like a mini Outrun cabinet? So I knocked up some artwork in Photoshop and then printed it off on my printer, which unfortunately can only do black and white because all the colour jets completely clogged up a while ago. And I was quite happy just to have it like that for a little bit, just with these black and white representations of the original Outrun stand-up arcade cabinet artwork. And then I got thinking to myself, oh, do you know what would be really nice? Is if I actually got this artwork properly printed out in colour onto nice sticky back plastic or vinyl that I could actually stick on the cabinet and make it just look, you know, that little bit more authentic. So I sent off a PDF file of the artwork to some printing company and they did that for me. And once that had come through, I thought to myself, well, this is all well and good, but do you know what would be even better still? Is if I could actually somehow play a proper arcade perfect version of Outrun on this machine. But being absolutely clueless as I was about anything electronics related, I took to the Build Your Own Arcade Controls forum to ask for a bit of advice there about what the best way to go about doing that would be. The common consensus on there was that trying to reuse the screen which came with the Retro Racer toy cabinet just wasn't going to be possible. And I already knew myself that the hardware that was running the current games was going to need to be scrapped too. But once I'd got the cabinet disassembled, behind the actual main control panel was just a regular PCB like you'd get in a joypad, with the little steering wheel operating a leaf switch which would control the left and right functions. The control panel PCB connected up to the actual hardware that the games were running on via a ribbon cable, and it very handily labelled which function did what on the PCB. So the advice that I got from the Build Your Own Arcade Controls forum was that by simply removing the ribbon cable and then connecting some wires from an arcade encoder up to the PCB, it would then make the PCB act like a USB joypad. So that was the control side of things sorted, theory-wise. Now the next thing was what to actually run the games on. So common logic would have suggested something like a Raspberry Pi 02, The only trouble being that they're out of stock in the UK, and the only way of getting them is paying about 5 times the price that they would cost normally from scalpers. Also, slight hiccup with that as well is I know absolutely nothing about Raspberry Pis, and just a little bit of research that I looked into for it in terms of trying to get a small one like that and then hooking it up with something like a 3.5-inch screen sounded a lot more complex than I imagined it would be. I was expecting it would just be some sort of plug and play solution, but no, it involves downloading all sorts of firmware and things like that. So actually sort of getting MAME set up on a Raspberry Pi didn't sound that difficult, but it was really the issue with the small screen, and then the fact that I'd need to put something that's going to produce sound in there as well suddenly made all that side of things seem like far more of a daunting challenge. But then I had a brainwave. I've actually already got a device which I carry around with me every day, which is capable of playing MAME, and it also does it in such a way that if you're using it in portrait mode rather than landscape mode, the play area that you're looking at automatically orientates itself to the top of the screen so that it would appear to be in just the right position for use within the Retro Racer cabinet. I am of course talking about my mobile phone. So I gave my actual current phone a little try within the case of the cabinet just to see how it would look. And apart from the fact that the Retro Racer's normal bezel was a little bit too small, so it was cropping the screen area off a little bit, it actually worked really well. So getting a second-hand Android phone to fit in the Retro Racer would sort out the issue of hardware to run it. I already knew how to get MAME working on it, the control panel should be plug and play with it, and it also sorts the sound issue out as well. So I had a look on eBay and I ended up picking up a refurbished second-hand Galaxy J5 from 2017. Now my current phone is less than 2 years old and is significantly more powerful than this old Samsung phone, but really as long as it was able to run MAME, this was the main thing. If it could do any other emulators on top of that, that would be a bonus. And at £60 this was definitely a budget friendly way of getting all those other bits working, sound, screen and hardware. I had done a little bit of research online before buying it just to check it would do what I wanted it to do, and on a forum I'd seen someone talking about running PPSSPP emulator on it. But when it actually came through, it was able to run most stuff on MAME, but some of the more advanced racers it did struggle with a little bit. For example, I can't play Outrunners, which is on the Sega System 32 hardware, without a lot of audio distortion and slowdown. But games like Chase HQ, Hang On, Super Hang On, Power Drift, Super Monaco GP all work absolutely fine on it. Weirdly though, the original Outrun, which is actually an older game than a lot of those, was also just struggling a tiny bit, so it needed some of the frame skipping options on to make it work, and it's not really noticeable once you've got the frame skip on, but you can just tell there is a very slight loss of smoothness in the frame rate. But I mean, you can see for yourself here on the finished cabinet, it's barely noticeable. But amazingly, even though Outrunners struggles in MAME, with a few little performance tweaks, PPSSPP emulator is able to play Outrun coast to coast at full speed with no problems with the audio at all. Amazing! So the next thing that I needed to do was to make space for the Samsung phone to actually fit inside the cabinet. So I used my Dremel multi-tool to basically cut out the battery compartment on the back. And you can see it here, still connected up to the original on-off button, as well as the hardware and the screen. I also had to get rid of a lot of the posts that were inside the cabinet that were used to actually screw the front and back together because they were getting in the way of the phone, so I dremeled those out too. And then what I also needed to do was remove the original screen bezel, then Dremel out the majority of the plastic behind that, which was actually the same size as the masked off area which was covering up the screen. And this was so that I could then put a new screen bezel in, which I'd made myself, which I cut from the clear plastic of a CD case. And you can see one of the prototype ones that I did here, which I eventually discarded because I realised it had a few scratches on the screen. So the next thing to do was to buy an arcade encoder to actually use with the control panel. And I ended up picking up this one here, which is called an SJ at JX Arcade USB encoder, which is compatible with PS3, PC and Android, and cost the bargain price of £19. Well, £19.99 if you're going to be precise. Now, although I know how arcade encoders work, having wired up the buttons to my arcade bar top cabinet about 7 years ago, I wasn't really sure how this would translate to wiring up the PCB, so I needed to turn back to the arcade controls forum here, and one of the moderators there gave me lots of really helpful advice about how you make ground wires work with this, which basically kind of does the same function that daisy chaining does when you're wiring up individual arcade buttons. Now, I will put my hand up here and admit I have no ability whatsoever when it comes to soldering or anything like that, but fortunately I know a man who does, and that is my good friend James. So I got in contact with him and asked him if he would like to get involved with this little project, and he very kindly agreed. So I took the PCB board over to his house along with the encoder and all the connections for it, and he soldered it all up for me, following the advice that Scott from the Build Your Own Arcade Controls forum had given me. I'd also bought a couple of small LED lights that could be plugged into the arcade encoder as well, with the idea that I was then going to cut out a big chunk of plastic where the marquee is, and I was going to put some clear plastic in there to light it up from behind. Getting the control panel properly working like this with the phone really felt like the first major step in terms of actually getting this project really working. What you'll also notice here is that I'm using a front end to load up the MAME games with there, and this is a front end I found on the Google Play Store called Dig, which is free. And it's really handy because it can be set to automatically power on when the phone is turned on, which is very handy when you physically can't get to the screen to actually press anything on it, and half of it's covered over by the actual arcade cabinet itself. I set the phone to have no password when it turns on, and the lock screen that comes up can just be bypassed just by pressing one of the buttons on the control panel. You can see here as well that in the time that I was waiting for the encoder to arrive in the post, I've repainted the buttons and the gear stick on the front of the arcade cabinet there. I've made the top 3 buttons there green to match the credit in button on a proper Outrun stand-up cabinet, and I've repainted the red accelerator and brake pedals silver with a little wash of black there just to make them look a little bit more metallic. You can also see here as well, without the screen bezel in, where I basically had to cut back all that red plastic to make the phone's play area fully visible and not having the top, bottom and sides of the screen all cut off. So now that everything was working, this just left one final problem to solve, which was how to fit everything into the minicab. See, my original idea for it before using the arcade encoder was to try and wire up the controls that are actually already in the cab to a little Bluetooth wireless pad, so there wouldn't be lots of cables and bits and pieces like that in there, but unfortunately that didn't work. Also, having to have a USB pad plugged into the phone also brought a new problem, which was how I was supposed to then charge up the battery in the phone if this cable is permanently plugged in. Because once the front and the back panel of the cabinet are screwed back together, the side arc goes over where the seam is that connects them, so there wouldn't be any way of physically getting to the phone without disturbing the side arc. So really, once the phone is inside the cabinet, it's inside the cabinet for good. I wasn't planning to open the cabinet back up again to access the phone. This is where cables to use for the phone also became a bit of an issue as well. So I was having to use something called an OTG cable, which has got a normal USB-A female connector which I can plug the arcade encoder into, and then that goes to a micro USB connector which I can plug into the phone. But an unfortunate issue with that was I couldn't then charge the phone by plugging a standard USB cable into the OTG cable. It turns out that some cables are specifically set up to carry data, but they can't charge the phone, and some work vice versa. So they'll charge the phone, but it wouldn't connect up the arcade encoder. Ugh. So the solution to this was to buy a micro USB hub adapter, which had a separate cable for power and 3 separate USB cables for data that I could plug the arcade encoder into. This again meant more space getting taken up, and I quickly realised that there was no way I was going to be able to fit all these bits and pieces into the cab. There was barely room for the phone itself to actually fit in there, particularly as well once I actually had the micro USB plugged into it, which made it a little bit taller. So I realised the solution for this was that I was going to have to cut a little hole in the bottom of the arcade machine, which meant the USB hub's micro USB connector could poke out the bottom of it, which wouldn't then make the phone too tall to fit in the cabinet and move the actual screen position. This also meant as well that I could fit the arcade encoder into a separate plinth underneath the arcade cabinet and then poke all the wires for that up through the hole to connect up to the control panel. Yeah, it would have been nice if I could have somehow fitted it all inside the cabinet itself, but there was just no way that was going to happen. Now, one of the benefits of being able to fit everything into a separate little box like this is I was able to add some additional buttons to the side of it there, which you just saw briefly. So I was able to add some extra joypad functions on, which is very useful because the amount on the front of the cabinet is a little bit limited, and unfortunately the one which is labelled as reset actually broke during the process of me moving everything through the hole in the bottom. The trace on the PCB is actually damaged, so that button's unusable now, unfortunately. But of all the buttons to break, that's probably the one which was the most easy to actually find another function for, using those buttons on the side of the box. So this is the cab in its nearly finished state. You can see I've got the light up marquee working now, and I've masked off the play area with some black paint. The box is completed. The only thing I haven't put in place yet is the rear panel, so you can see how the phone sits in the back of the cabinet there and how the LEDs sit in place. And the only other thing that I had to think about was how to actually power it on whilst the phone is inside, and you can just see on the right there I've put a little tiny red button which I drilled a hole through the cabinet to put in place, and then I just used a very small amount of hot glue just to attach it to the phone's actual physical power button. I did look into whether it might be possible to try and actually connect the phone's power button to the on-off switch on the back of the actual arcade cabinet and actually properly wire it in, but this would have just been way too difficult. In order to actually get to the bit of the circuit where you get to the power button, you've got to take the screen off. The phone isn't designed to sort of easily clip open like the old-fashioned phones used to be, so this kind of slightly low-tech solution of just drilling a hole in the side, physically attaching a button, just worked out a lot easier. And you can just see the phone going through its boot process there, with the front end dig automatically starting. So with all those bits and pieces sorted out, there was just one last thing left to do, which was to fix the whopping big hole that I'd cut in the back of the cabinet in order to get the battery compartment out to make room for the phone to fit in the first place. Now this is where the expertise of the Build Your Own Arcade Controls forum came in useful again, where one of the forum members there, called Badmouth, recommended a technique of using acetone to melt plastic, and I was then able to use this melted plastic to then patch the holes around the battery cover to get it whole again, and then after quite a bit of sanding and a bit of spray painting, getting it almost looking back to normal. So once the back cover was in place, the very final touch was to apply a Ferrari transfer sticker to the middle of the wheel, just to give it that real classic Outrun stand-up cabinet look. And there we go, project finished. From Retro Racer toy cabinet to a genuine upright miniature racing cabinet capable of playing actual arcade games.
Nice.
So there we go, that is my complete in-depth look at how I created the mini Outrun racer. So if you've got any ideas about a project like this you want to do yourself, hopefully you'll have found this useful. I mean, certainly for me it was interesting how this project evolved from me just initially wanting to make a bit of artwork to stick on the side of one of these cabinets to eventually deciding, you know what, I'm going to go the whole hog and actually convert it into a proper little arcade machine. So if you've enjoyed this video, please don't forget to do the old like, share and subscribe jig, and hopefully I will catch you for my next video. So I am Mr. Thundering, and I will catch you again sometime soon. Take care, bye bye.